Good morning to all, and welcome to day two of the St. Macrina seminar on the Incarnation by Saint Athanasius. We are pleased and grateful to be led by David Goa this week. David, please.
Lovely to see each one of you. I would like to begin this morning by having Bob, he sent me a little note with a poem by a British poet, and just as a little invocation. Could you read that for us, Bob? I'm sorry, you're muted.
Actually, this poem is by J.R. Tolkien, but
Quoted by
Malcolm Guite, the poet, which David referenced, quotes it in a book called Faith, Hope, and Poetry, Theology and the Poetic Imagination. And I just happen to have been reading this book, and Guite encloses a portion of a much longer poem by Tolkien called Mythopoeia, the myth making. And so just the short excerpt is this, because I felt it captured much of our discussion yesterday morning. Mythopoeia by J.R. Tolkien. The heart of man is not compound of lies, but draws some wisdom from the only wise, and still recalls him. Though how long estranged, man is not wholly lost, nor wholly changed. Disgraced he may be, yet he is not dethroned, and keeps the rags of lordship once he owned. His world dominion by creative act, not his to worship, the great artifact. Man's subcreator, the refracted light, through whom is splintered from a single white to many hues, and endlessly combined in living shapes that move from mind to mind.
Amen. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for that. Since we're at a table together, are there themes or matters from yesterday that continue to move in your mind and your heart that maybe we can just recall for a few minutes? Is there anything that you would like to place in front of us before we begin today? Yes, Kahindi. Kahindi?
Yeah.
Oh, there you are. I can hear you now.
Actually, I imagine that what was going on in my mind will be addressed in the topic today. I was just looking at the chasm between the profundity, of human being, created, in the image of God, with such giftedness, with such potential. And I was comparing it, the Pauline lamentation about, his own struggle.
Mm-hmm.
So I was perusing, our text for today. I'm thinking that maybe we look at, that aspect, of that gap,
Mm-hmm.
Because I think at one time or the other,
I'm sorry?
I personally do feel it.
Yeah.
As at one time or another, I do feel, that chasm myself, that
Mm-hmm.
if I'm so beautifully and wonderfully, created, but there's this burden, there's this struggle, you know. Yeah, I suppose this morning, our reading today will address that aspect. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And feel free to reflect more on it as we walk into the text today. And you're not the only one that feels that. That is central to the spiritual life of most of us, I think. Thank you. Any other matters that you'd like to put on the table initially? Andrew?
I think that Kinley pointed to what was on my mind too. He seems to be saying in what we looked at yesterday, if we but live and partake of creation as the gift it is, then we will know our Lord. And if we live and partake of creation as if it's our own object or thing, we will not know and partake of God. And it seems to be fleshed out nicely in what comes today, our involvement, our part of creation.
Thank you. So today we will be listening to and engaging Athanasius's consideration of the divine dilemma regarding knowledge and ignorance. And we'll be doing a close reading of section 13 and section 17. What is meant by knowledge? What is meant by ignorance? As we discussed a bit yesterday, from the Hebrew Bible on through the patristics, knowledge is not a matter of concepts. It's not objects, but rather it is a relationship born of love, nurtured by regard, a relationship that is one of communion. One only knows in communion, in love. And that knowledge has at its very heart a kind of unfolding. At its heart, it is a mystery of wonder. And ignorance. What is ignorance? What does it mean? To ignore, to be distracted, to not be present. Ignorance is not for Athanasius or for this golden strand of the Christian tradition, is not a matter of not knowing the theology, not having a proper theological cathedral, not lining up your conceptual sense of things, but rather it is also relational, the lack thereof. It is what happens when we project onto the reality that is coming to greet us some abstraction, some presumption, some fear, some desire. So, a few remarks. We are made for communion. We're made out of God's, in some sense, God's overflowing love and delight. And this communion is spousal in nature. We see it discussed and reflected on in the narratives of the Hebrew Bible and also in the gospel. It's always a communion of intimacy, a communion of willed, where love arises and in a sense is enjoyed. It is in joy. We are made to freely abide in that. And in and through that abiding, we also draw near the creator of all. We draw near our neighbor. We draw near all creation. So when we say that the human being, when in the Hebrew Bible, it says that the human being is made in the image of God, it is saying a couple things to us. Because for Jews, well, God's name and names may be in some sense attended to. The name of God is never spoken. It's a discipline that the Jews have, because God as well can be turned into an idolatry, an abstraction, a weapon. So the spiritual discipline of Jews, when they're reading the Torah and they come to the name of God, they never pronounce it. And it's a discipline to that end, a discipline to help them understand how dangerous it is to assume, as was common in the ancient world and common in ours, that if you know the name of God, the name of a deity, that gives you leverage. You can propitiate. You can imagine yourself getting God, that deity, on your side, doing your bidding. So to know God, to regard, to seek to abide, to seek to draw near, and to know oneself, the image of God, which is in a sense the opposite of what we think of ourselves. These are coterminous. They occur together. They're holding hands. They're bound together. I think that's the reason why a number of the church fathers and spiritual mothers have said over and over again, you may be the only Christ the stranger ever meets. You may be the only Christ, the only anointed one, the only one with the oil of gladness the stranger ever meets. So, in this sense of knowing the word of the Father, the word that speaks in the world, the word that is in one's own being, that is what it means to live a blessed life. But when we withdraw from that, even maybe despise it, despise the grace that is given, despise or unable for some reason to know in love, then our soul, as Athanasius says, is darkened. We turn to the creation rather than the creator. And what he means by turning to the creation is not to God's creation. We're turning to a creation of our own fantasy. We're turning to our way of recreating the world. It's curious, and we see it in that narrative in Genesis 3. The very moment we no longer are alive to being the image of God in God's world, we recreate the world through the prism of our own passions, our own desires, our own fears. The world is recreated. Our sense of it is recreated. So when he's speaking about creation rather than the creator, he's really saying, when you no longer are attentive, drawing near to the mystery of what comes to greet you, you are seeing the world through the image of your own passions. And that's really what idolatry is. It is to have one's own passions and preoccupations as the kind of, well, Jeremy, you're a psychologist, so you know about this in so many of your conversations with people. The only thing we see in others or in the life of the world or even in our past, it all becomes a kind of Rorschach, which calls forth our fear, our desire. And it's that kind of appearance, the projection of our appetites, which is stepping aside of reality. We're no longer living in the real world. So when we turn, in this sense, from the creator to the creations of our own making, we turn away from the reality that's given to us. In section 12, Athanasius says that the grace of being in the image was sufficient to know the God Word, and through him, the Father. The grace of being in the image. Or as the Apostle Paul says, it is written upon the hearts of all human beings. This is the God-given condition of the wonder of being a human being. And that is sufficient to know, again in this sense, communion, regard, love, the God Word, and through him the Father. So in that sense, as was raised yesterday, I think by Michael, that Word created the world, has been present since the foundations of the world, and is laid on every human heart. Athanasius goes on to say, but knowing the weakness of human beings, Yeah, it's an odd weakness. God anticipated also their carelessness. Note the word, their inability to care for what is real, only caring for what they presume. So that if they cared not to recognize God through themselves, through the works of creation, they might not, alas, be ignorant of the Creator. So God gave the law and the prophets in the hope that we human beings would, since they were close by us, he says, receive their instruction. And yesterday I mentioned around the word commandment and Moses journeying up the mountain that he does it many times. Commandment is not the word that's used really until Deuteronomy. It's not used in the first covenant. What the rabbis point out in that is that Moses goes up the mountain several times and he brings his counsel up the mountain several times. Something is going on. There's a relationship that's beginning to unfold. There is a dialogue. I have loved the word dialogue for years, although now I'm a little bit hesitant about it because it's become almost a plastic word in some quarters. But when you think of it, it really means logos, two logoi in conversation with each other, speaking heart to heart, not periphery to periphery, not negotiating, not arguing, unfolding, discovering, attending, caring for the clarity of the word that is borne by others. So God gave the law and the prophets in the hope that we would come to understand again, engage a metanoia, turn around, reorient our lives toward God, and thus towards a proper relationship with creation, that we would return to knowing God, return to love, regard, communion in the mystery of it all. The prophets, he says, were for the Jews and for the whole of the human family, a sacred school of the knowledge of God. Again, knowledge, love, regard, communion, and the conduct of the soul, the movements of the soul. Just several remarks about section 13. That, Bob, you have the text handy. Would you care to read it for us? Just a couple remarks about it, and then let's listen to that particular text. Athanasius, in his reflection, and I'm reminded that sometimes when we read what can strike us as a kind of critical remark about human beings, we need to take a lesson from Matthew 25, from that gospel text, that parable about the last judgment, where Jesus Christ says on the last day, they will be gathered and they will separate the sheep from the goats. And when you read Matthew 25, I've engaged this text with a number of Christians over a number of years. And it struck me as so curious how often when they read that text, they will read it and it's inherent in what even in some Bibles is given as its title, as the sermon of the narrative of the last judgment, the parable of the last judgment. But I hear Jesus Christ speaking that with tears, not with judgment, not from a throne, but with tears. When I was hungry, you did not feed me. When I was naked, you did not clothe me. When I was sick and imprisoned, you did not visit me. Where were you? Where were you, Adam? Where were you, Eve? Why had you fled paradise? Why weren't you with me? And similarly, as in that narrative, he turns to the ones on the right, repeats the same words. When I was hungry, you fed me. When I was naked, you clothed me. When I was sick and imprisoned, you came by me. So I think when we read some of these texts in Athanasius, it might be useful to remember he was a monk. And we have that rich tradition in Christianity of what's called the gift of tears, pentheos, the gift of tears. And as, again, a number of the church fathers and mothers, including some of them in the West, have reflected on coming before the bridal chamber. They've reflected on what do we carry, what do we have in our hands when we come before the throne of God's grace. And they have said, all that we have in our hands is our tears. All that we have in our hands is the response of mercy. So Athanasius says, human beings so turned away. This is language of sorrow. Became so irrational is the term that's used here. And I'd like maybe Andrew to reflect on that a little bit as we move along. Became so irrational, so lacking of the word, so lacking of their logoi, so without regard for the logos in all creation, that the knowledge of God, their inclination to regard, their inclination to wonder, their inclination to draw near, to be in communion with, that their knowledge of God was overwhelmed by the deceit of demons, the deceit of your daemon, of your little self, of your presumed self, of your sufferings, your passions. So I read this, I don't know, of course, but to me it rings of somebody who's looked at the world and it just brings sorrow, not judgment, but sorrow at the tragedy of not living out of the image of God. What was God to do, he says? What was God to do who's the lover of the world? Having made human beings in his image and for a loving relationship. What was God to do? How could the goodness of God, having made humans in his own image, how could the goodness of God allow his image to be destroyed? Or maybe it would be, I have to be careful with that. Whose image? God's image, yes, but in the person to be destroyed. What should be done then, other than the renewal again in the image, so that through it, human beings would be able once again to enter into love, communion, regard, and draw near to the mystery of it all. So the Word of God, the Logos, came himself in order that he, being the image of the Father, the human being in the image, might be recreated. The gospel, I've sometimes asked people, what really is the gospel of Jesus Christ? And of course, when you think about it a little bit, it's pretty simple. God is love. And in God, there is no death, no dying, no shadow of turning. God is love, those three words. So he took for himself and our sake a mortal body. And Athanasius says that in it, death might henceforth be destroyed utterly, and human being be renewed again according to the image. In it, all of our death dealing, because every time we presume about the world, we deal death to the reality that is attempting to address us from the world, so that might be destroyed utterly, so that the unreality will be destroyed. I think of the liturgy of St. John Chrysostom, where we chant in every liturgy. How does the word go? And let your enemies be destroyed and wiped off the face of the earth. And I think, yeah, let unreality be wiped off the face of the earth. Let alienation be wiped off the face of the earth. Let our ignorance in this sense, let my habits of ignoring be wiped off the face of the earth, so that the presence of the kingdom is what I have drawn near to. So section 13. Bob, would you be so kind as to read this for us? This is page 77. And you're muted, I think, Bob. And one of the things that those of us who've been spending time with Maximus have reflected on a number of times, and really, I have, through those reflections, come to appreciate just how central it is to the gospel and how central it is to Christian understanding, is this question of tone. I mean, it seems curious to say it, but if you, in English, I assume in all languages, Sylvie could tell us about French and Spanish, if this is how it works. Your tone carries meaning, carries an enormous amount of the meaning of the words. In a sense, tone, maybe I could put it this way, tone is the skeleton of the word. So let's think of that as we listen to Athanasius.
Since then, human beings have become so irrational, and demonic deceit was thus overshadowing every place and hiding the knowledge of the true God. What was God to do? Be silent before such things and let human beings be deceived by the demons and the ignorant of God and be ignorant of God? But then what need was there in the beginning for human beings to come into being in the image of God? He should have come into being simply irrational, or having been rational, not live the life of the irrational creatures. What need at all was there for him to receive a notion about God from the beginning? For if he is not now worthy to receive it, neither should it have been given him from the beginning. Or what profit would there be to the Maker God, or what glory for him if human beings brought into being by him did not revere him, but reckoned others to be their makers? For God would be found creating them for others and not for himself. Moreover, a king, being human, does not permit the lands established under him to pass to and serve others, nor does he abandon them to others, but he reminds them with letters, often enjoins them by friends, and if need be, comes himself, shaming them by his own presence, only so that they not serve others and his work be in vain. How much more will God allow his own creatures to not be led astray from him and serve things that do not exist? In particular, since such errors is the cause of their destruction and disappearance, it was not right that those who had once partaken of the image of God should be destroyed. What then was God to do? Or what should be done except to renew again in the image, so that through it human beings would be able once again to know him? But how could this have occurred except by the coming of the very image of God, our Savior, Jesus Christ? For neither by human beings was it possible, since they were created in the image, but neither by angels, for they were not even images. So the Word of God came himself, in order that he, being the image of the Father, the human being in the image, might be recreated. It could not again have been in any other way, without death and corruption being utterly destroyed. So he rightly took a mortal body, that in it death might be henceforth be destroyed utterly, and human beings be renewed again according to the image. For this purpose, then, there was need of none other than the image of the Father.
Thank you. Andrew, would you say a little bit about this word irrational and help us understand, help us get over our inheritance? Because we have such a habit of thinking that reason, and thus the irrational, is we inherit it from the 18th century. So would you speak a little bit about that? And then I will ask the rest of you to enter into this text as you would like to.
It's a good place to open up. David, I'm glad you pointed to this because it's this along with silence in the third line struck me, and I had in mind too. So it's good, and then we can open it up and see. So irrational. If we think of irrational as unreasonable, and then we think of reason as the ability to calculate and thus diagnose the world appropriately, it's very strange. And it starts to sound like we lost our mental capacity for argument, and thus we began to not know. The word reason or rational has been, let's say, eased a little bit in my mind lately because of the what's connotated or the associated word rationale, kind of the sense behind why one is moving the way one is moving. That seems to me a nicer way into reason and irrational. But the word that's translated is logos. So it means without the logos, essentially. And David, you just gave that really lovely reflection on the word, dialogue through the logos onto another logos, right? So irrational means, first of all, it strikes me that means that deep intimacy is not there. The logos is neither kind of affirmed and recognized within oneself or within another person. And thereby, we come to be subject to demonic deceit. And like David said, a demon is like a little god. It's our own little god. We've confused our little god with the one true God. We've mistaken the logos in ourselves. We start following our own God. And then we wonder because we think silence is the opposite of what we're up to. If we can't recognize the logos in ourselves in another person, then we won't be able to recognize it in silence. But one of the things that Athanasius, pardon me, Maximus's name came up. Athanasius seems to be saying here is that, like David said yesterday, we have to take care that our image of God, as it were, is not too small. So God is not just a word and not silent. He's not within, but not without. And so the logos is in the silence of creation too, but we couldn't recognize it. That's part of what Athanasius is saying. We lost our ability to attend to it in creation and also in ourselves. And we come to this strange state. So that's what struck me about these opening few lines. I'm not sure if that's kind of plunging in a little bit into too many waters or something, but that's what stood out for me, this idea of logos, alogos, connected with silence and dialogue as well.
So it's a self-loss,
Mm-hmm.
the fundamental self-loss.
Mm-hmm. And yesterday you quoted Yaroslav Pelikan, David, saying, if we're not clear about our God, how can we be clear about ourselves? And that's what we see here. We're confused, as you said. Yeah, it's really beautifully put.
Thank you. Are there questions, queries, not questions so much, but responses? about this particular text or what's led up to it that you would like to ponder a little bit more?
I really like, I'm assuming, Andrew, the Greek word there at the beginning of 13 is a logothenton
Yeah.
for irrational. Okay. I really appreciate the, the dialectical part that you've been bringing up. Just makes me thinking of doing couples work and trying to uh, enhance the betweenness between people. And it reminds me of like, Buber's, moving from I, thou to I, it, instead of like, there's this betweenness between us, the I and the thou. I, it is when we manipulate the world, when we turn the other into an it or something to be, we project our passions or we project our fear or we project our shame onto the other. And then we lose that betweenness, we lose the logos. And it's as much about between us and other beings, humans, and also us with ourselves. Um, the relationship with ourselves, whether that's, um, I mean, the concept of shame comes up so much in my work and is, I think, the root cause of so much of humanity's problems is that we don't want to experience shame, so um, we appease others or we avoid others or we project that shame onto others. And it's been happening since the garden. Adam blames Eve, or we have to cover up our shame, or we hide from God, or Cain, out of his shame, kills his brother, or the prodigal son, out of his shame, doesn't feel he's worthy to return. So it's the alienation, uh, the lostness that gets in between the betweenness that we're supposed to have to have that right relationship. So yeah, that's what's sort of stirring in me as we are a logoi. Yeah.
And shame, when we read it in the Hebrew Bible narrative of Genesis 3, the response, the inner response and the response of Adam and Eve, the response of the human nature. This is a narrative about the human nature. It's not a narrative about some incident. It's a narrative about the common incident.
Mm-hmm.
When you forget yourself, when you imagine you are not what you are, which is what that temptation was about. The human nature has to imagine it is insufficient, that its relationship is insufficient. When that occurs, the immediate response is shame. And in a way, that's a call. That's a call. Because in it is a revelation. You have forgotten how you are made. You have stepped into a world of your own making. You have stepped into a world out of communion, a world that suddenly is reconfigured through the image of your own passion. And so you hide. And then we have that haunting part of the narrative where Adonai, blessed be he, comes into the garden and cries out, Adama, Adama, Eva, Eva, where did you go? Where did you go? It's the tears of God, the tears of the Logos. Because all of the biblical manifestations of the divine are understood as Jesus Christ, as the presence of the Logos, in some sense enfleshed. And similarly, after our brother Cain thought his offering was insufficient, was jealous of the offering made by Abel, God also comes to him. Adonai comes to him. The Logos arises and says, Cain, Cain, where is your brother? Why have you passed out of the presence? So it's, I'm sure in your work, Jeremy, this is a huge matter, as it is for all of us that are privileged ever to listen to the struggles of other human beings. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Other reflections? Following on this reading, Athanasius begins to unwrap some of this again and walks around it again. We see in this work what we see in so much patristic writing, that it is not moving from A to B or A to Z, or if you prefer Z. It is a walking around. It's a kind of circumambulating. It's looking at these matters in a variety of ways. So he begins with, in section 14, just as an icon becomes soiled, just as an image, just as a logos, a word, becomes soiled with the dust of ages. That is, soiled with all those temporal preoccupations, which are not bad, but they're temporal. Just as the icon, the image, becomes soiled with the dust of ages and needs to be cleaned and restored for the portrait, for the word to be seen, so the all-holy Son of the Father, being the image of the Father, came to our place to renew the human being made according to himself, and to find him, and I sense the tears here again in Athanasius, and find him as one lost, that is one who no longer has departed from his own logoi, departed from his or her own being, through the forgiveness of sins, as he himself says in the gospel, for the forgiveness of missing the mark, of stepping outside yourself, of stepping outside creation, stepping outside of communion, stepping outside of abiding nearby Adonai. As he says in the gospel, I came to seek and to save that which is lost. The incarnation of the Logos, the incarnation of Jesus Christ, is solely within our tradition a healing journey. It is solely a healing journey to seek and save that which is lost. I'm reminded as I read this of a reflection I read a while back in a little book written by an Italian priest along with Pope Francis. The Italian priest is a chaplain in prisons in Rome. And, not all priests get to have tea with the Pope. But what happened in that prison is that on several occasions, the Pope, driving his own little Fiat, had snuck out of his apartment in the Vatican into his car, much to the consternation of the Swiss guard, and went to the prison at midnight. And since he's the Pope, I guess he has some privileges, so they didn't ask for identification. And they let him in, and he goes in to wash the feet of the prisoners. And that led to this reflection on the prayer, the Our Father, written by the Pope and by this Italian priest. And in it, there is the mention of the Pope having a set of images above his desk in his modest apartment. As you know, he does not live in the usual papal palace, but he lives in a modest apartment. And it's a set of images from a column. I can't recall the church. I believe it's in Italy or Spain. And on the capital of the column, there's a set of images. The first image carved in stone, is of Judas rushing out of the Last Supper. The next image is of Judas taking the 30 pieces of silver from the priests, as it says in the narrative, from the judicial court, the Sanhedrin, or the Sharia court, as we might call it these days. The third image is of him kissing Jesus Christ in the garden and the arrest. The fourth image is of Judas going back, as you recall in the narrative, and trying to give back the 30 pieces of silver. I have accused a just man. The next image is of Judas hanging himself. And the last image that the Pope has above his desk is of Jesus Christ, the one who came to seek the one who was lost, the Good Shepherd, carrying Judas on his shoulders. I came to seek and to save that which was lost. So how to move human beings who tragically we often wallow in our own illusions about God, our own illusions about the human nature, our own illusions about our brothers and sisters. How is God to reach them, to reach us? The works of creation were so neglected, so misunderstood, Athanasius says in this passage. Human beings no longer could even see their own image, no longer could be as they were created to be. human beings become deeply out of touch. The projections upon the world always mirror our daemon, our images of ourselves. And we then see only a false image of ourselves. And God wishes to help human beings. Sojourned, Athanasius said, as a human being, taking to himself a body like theirs. And from below, from down and out, from the pit, from 3 days in the tomb, through the body might know the word of God in the body, and through him, the creator of all that is, and the lover of the world. In the icon of the resurrection, an ancient icon in the Christian East, we see the resurrected Christ reaching down past the shattered gates and the shattered locks, down into the place of darkness, the place of death, and pulling forth Adam and Eve, pulling forth the human nature. Adonai, blessed be he, cannot heal the human nature, heal any of us against our will, because we're made in freedom, because we're made in love. Where there is no freedom, there's no love. But Adonai, blessed be he, can visit again and show again, give us a theophany. Say, this is who you are. This is who you are. So he moves on to say that, like a good teacher, he moves toward the student as the student understands, and so builds on what is offered as knowledge or as ignorance, what is offered in love, in regard, in communion, or what we think, what we then offer as ignorance, as distraction, as an inability to be present to the reality that is addressing us. Athanasius goes on to say that God takes to himself a body and dwells as human among humans, and draws to himself the perceptible senses of all human beings. In so doing, God hopes to dispel our predilection to idolatry, our predilection to seeing something as ultimate, which is just temporal, seeing something as ultimate that is in our mind, something we treasure, something we think is significant. And restore us. It invites us to draw near again to that logoi that we are and that dwells in all of creation. He then walks into a set of idolatries, and I want to just linger on these briefly. He speaks of the idolatry and asks you to think about what might these mean in our own life, in our own world today. He talks about the idolatry of material things of this life. Goes back to mentioning wood and stone. This seems to me to, when we think of images of wood and stone, these are the sacralities that the prophets were preoccupied with. There's a lovely story told by the rabbis about Abraham when he was 13 years old in his father's house in Ur of the Chaldees. And the rabbis talk about how Abraham's father was an idol maker. He would make sacred images. So what would those sacred images be? Well, they were the images that people liked to have because they were aware of the fact that there are lots of wonders in creation. So one of them obviously would be the goddess of the hearth. That is the sacrality of home. Another is the god of your village or city, the deity of your tribe. Deities associated with what you do, what you make with your hands, whether it is the one that works metal and creates out of metal something that is useful for human beings, the wonder of the forge, or the marvel of taking a few seeds, putting them in the earth, and harvesting 10,000 as a result. These marvelous ways in which creation is bound together, all of these have deities associated with them, and people venerate or worship them. Pregnancy, birth giving, adulthood, all of these are the normal sacralities of life. And they're all a gift. They're all places of mystery and of wonder. But of course, any one of them can fall into the center. And when it falls into the center, you begin to think that is God. So the story goes that Abraham's father had to go to the souk, go to the market. So he said to his 13-year-old precocious son, "Take care of the shop while I'm gone." And so he left, and Abraham, being 13 years old, reminds me a little bit about when I knew Andrew, who was maybe just about that age when I first met him. Abraham goes and takes the club out of the largest deity in the shop, goes around and smashes all the others, and then puts the club back in the deity's hand. Abraham's father comes home and says, "What's happened here? What's happened here?" And Abraham says, like Eve, like Adam, "He did it. He did it." And the rabbis say that the response of the father was, "What do you mean he did it? He's just an idol." And Abraham says, "Oh." So that's the birth of the inkling, the birth of that inkling in Abraham and Sarah, which leads them on that journey. Perhaps there is a God above the gods. Perhaps the ultimate is not captured in wood and stone or in these sacralities, as important as they are. He then talks about the idolatry of human beings, mistaking them for gods, emperors, magicians, shamans. And how people can become enthralled by other human beings because of their dress or their headgear, or because of their political power or their athletic prowess. He talks about the idolatry of demons, That is, the diseases that so often can define our life. I think of all the healing narratives in the Gospels. Pelikan, in his book on Jesus through the centuries, begins it by saying, if we could, through some magical way, use a magnet to pull out of all of Western culture everything that has the mark of Jesus on it, what would be left? So the narratives of the gospel, of all the healing gospels, are so significant because we know that in all of these people that Jesus Christ healed, they all died, just like everybody else. But those healing narratives speak to how deeply in bondage one can be by one's own suffering, whether it's mental, physical, psychological, spiritual. And the healing narratives, whatever they do in the Gospels, whatever those healing narratives do to the disease, they absolutely transform the way in which the person understands themselves and their disease. How to anoint the wound so that the wound no longer is the prism through which you see yourself and understand your relationship to everybody else in the world. And finally, he speaks about the idolatry of death, the cult of the dead. This is a way of speaking about how easy we can be possessed by nostalgia, by what once was, or perhaps never was, but we imagined it was. How we can be engaged in the idolatry of the heroes of the past and then not attend to what's unfolding in our own life. So he spends some time on this, and it's very worthy because idolatry is, some of it is projected out, some of it is what's inside that's projected out, some of it's put upon us, and all of it makes life idle, is a form of disengagement. I don't suppose people these days, many of them drive stick shifts, but since I'm old enough to have done that, when you put a car in idle, in my playful mind always thinks of that as a spiritual discipline to contemplate idolatry. It means you're not moving. You're no longer in the dialogue. You're no longer in the presence of unfolding life. So the God Word incarnate is Savior of all. So the model and teacher of the human nature, Jesus Christ, and of all who may know God, that is the healing salve. That is what makes it possible to resurrect from these forms of death and move back into the world again. So since human beings were in the thrall of what Athanasius calls perceptible things, that is, things that they perceive, that they think are significant, since we're captured by these things, the Word becomes incarnate in a body in the hope that seeing Him as a human being like us, we may be persuaded also through His works, the works that He effected in the world, all these healing narratives, that He is not a man only, Athanasius says, but God, and He, Word and wisdom, of the true God. So not a man only, but God. And I would add to this, although I hope that that this is not untoward, so that we come to see that the human being is the image of God. The human problem is always a misunderstanding both of God and the human nature, and they go hand in hand, and they never let go of each other's hands. Both of them are recovered simultaneously, just as they are lost simultaneously. So, seeing Christ the Word, we also come to see, as Paul says, the presence of the Logos in all creation. The Apostle Paul writes in Ephesians, being rooted and grounded in love, in communion, in regard, in wonder, that you may have power to comprehend with all the saints what is the breadth and length and height and depth, and to know the love of Christ, which surpasseth knowledge, that you may be filled with the fullness of God. So we come to section 17. And Jeremy, would you be able to read this for us? So just a couple remarks. Athanasius speaks here about how Christ's incarnation is not an enclosure, but a revelation also about all creation. At its essence, all creation bears a logoi. In this sense, we have the cosmic Christ that patristic theology was so grasped by, and that is developed so remarkably by Maximus the Confessor and many others along the path. So the living word, the living Logos, gives life to all and is present in all. Creation came to be through the word and is sustained by the word. As many other church fathers say, creation is held together by the living word. Creation is held together by grace. We are in the presence of the kingdom where all is held together in grace. So the incarnation sanctifies the body. That is, it draws us back to realize that our body, our being, is sanctified. We can forget it. We can step aside of it. But that's what it is. It vivifies and purifies, Athanasius says, even the mortal body. So, Jeremy, would you read 17 for us?
Okay. For he was not enclosed in the body, nor was he in the body, but not elsewhere. Nor while he moved that body was the universe left void of his activity and providence. But what is most marvelous, being the Word, he was not contained by anyone, but rather himself contained everything. And as being in all creation, he is in essence outside everything, but inside everything by his own power, arranging everything and unfolding his own providence in everything, to all things, and giving life to each thing and to all things together, containing the universe and not being contained, but being wholly in every respect in his own Father alone. So also being in the human body and himself giving it life, he properly gives life to the universe also, and was both in everything and outside all. And being made known from the body through the work, he was not unseen even from the working of the universe. It is the function of the soul to see by reasoning even what is outside its own body, without, however, acting outside its own body, or to move things distant from the body by its presence. Never, that is, does a human being, by thinking of things at a distance, thereby move or displace them. Nor if one sat in his own home and considered the things in heaven, would he thereby move the sun or rotate the heavens. But he sees them moving and existing whilst not being able to act upon them. But such was not the case for the Word of God in the human being, for he was not bound to the body, but rather was himself wielding it, so that he was both in it and in everything, and was outside everything, and at rest in the Father alone. And the most wonderful thing was that he both sojourned as a human being, and as the Word begot life in everything, and as the Son was with the Father. Therefore he himself did not suffer when the Virgin gave birth, nor by being in the body was he defiled, but rather he sanctified the body also. Nor being in all things does he partake of all, but rather everything bore life and was nourished by him. But if the Son too, made by him and seen by us, circling in heaven, is not polluted by touching bodies upon the earth, nor is destroyed by darkness, but rather itself enlightens and purifies them, but so much more the all-holy Word of God, the Maker of the Son and Lord, in being made known in the body was not polluted, but rather being incorruptible, vivified and purified even the mortal body. For he committed no sin, it says, nor was deceit found in his mouth.
Do you hear him responding to Arius in this passage? Arius, who was saying, as is so obvious, how can God be incarnate? How can God have a body? How can God die? So this constant reference to the body seems to me to be one of the hallmarks of the Eastern patristic thinkers. There's a sense in which they are endeavoring to remind us that as human beings, we do not have a body or have a soul, as if those are distinct in us. We are a person with a nature that is given, and a personhood that can move towards abiding near God and our neighbor. So it was ubiquitous in the ancient world, and I think it's still very, very common for people to think of the human being as a set of things, as split. I like to put it this way, that this tradition of thinking does not say that human beings have a soul. It is saying we are a soul. We are saying that the incarnation is it. This is who we are created to be. And it is God's work for friendship and love. So what do you hear in this passage? What would you like to tease up and walk into a little bit? What is striking? Provocative, curious.
I can suggest one way, just kind of following along some of the pathways you've opened for us, David. This last clarification you made, we don't have a body, have a soul. We are a person. We are a soul. That's that urge to see it as one and not the other, to hold a few things together and then reject some and accept others. That seems to me to be important. And the first paragraph of this, the first paragraph of this section, he was enclosed in the body. He was not enclosed in the body, nor was he in the body, but not elsewhere. Being the Word, he was not contained by anyone, but rather himself contained everything, and so on and so forth. He's not within or without. It's not here or there. It's not human and thus not God, or subject to, not subject. I have to be careful with phrasing. This might not be phrased properly, but partaking of our life and, or returning, but partaking of our death in a way. He's life and death. It's this and that. And this, so that's one thought. It's a nice gathering, as you put it. This might touch another thing you brought up at the beginning, which I think is interesting. When in one of the early sections, he talks about quoting from the scriptures, shifting focus from creator to creation, and that's the standard way of phrasing idolatry. But you reminded us that it's not God's creation that the shift is to; it's our fantasy about it. In the past, I've always kind of thought, looked on it almost like it could be a healthy sort of natural life, but that's not what is talking. It's not one thing missing. The whole thing is overturned here in the focus on creation. And then I think when we're talking about idolatry, and you laid it out well, at one point you said idolatry is our passions and our predilections overlaid onto the world. And in page 75, section 11, throughout, but here just at the top of 75, Athanasius says, they fabricated idols for themselves instead of the truth. And I think I assumed, or have assumed, that the act of idolatry was always an act, like it was something we did rather than did not do.
Mm.
But here, Athanasius is saying, and your comments on ignorance about not being present, turning away from, it's not doing or not doing. It's not that good and bad is in the doing and the not doing, we're just refraining from it. It's something beyond that idea that an action means this and then non-action means this. It's the whole condition. And I think you pointed to that at the very beginning when you said knowledge is not concepts. It's not you can get one concept right and and the other one not right, so you're not quite as smart as the one who got them all right. It's a quality or tonality, as you put it, of relation. Apart from that relation, everything is senseless. It doesn't matter if we think we're acting or not acting, or we think it's aesthetic or noetic, or it's a figure or form. Whenever we start breaking apart creation, my soul is good, but my body needs work. I'll struggle with it, but my soul is good before we start breaking it up. And that to me it seems to be what Athanasius is overturning in this first paragraph. We can't strip it down and start saying this is blessed by God and this over here is, we get rid of it and then it's all better. And you've brought this out lovely in a lovely way. And Athanasius reminds us of this on every page. It's the whole that's in so that's in question, really. And so I guess the word I would put back to you or open up for us, this missing of the mark, it's a whole, is it an absence of relationship? Is it a non-recognition, the form of relationship that needs to be? But it's not a question of this or that act. And it seems to me the reduction of life or meaning to this or that act is what's part of what Athanasius is combating. If God died, that act defines God. How can God die? It's not, and Athanasius says, no, broad. That's my way of walking back in.
Mm-hmm. Lovely. Kahindi, were you pondering here?
Yes, yes. I'm still on that paragraph, that first paragraph. There's a complexity there that I think our Enlightenment conception, which specializes in breaking things down, separating things, may not be able to comprehend here. And I think somebody that said something that is related to this in recent years, Sally McFake, the theologian, ecologist, calling the entire creation the body of God, which sounds heretic in some evangelical minds, but I'm coming to appreciate where she's coming from. And I think our tendency to want to separate, I mean, you said also that, human beings don't have soul. Human beings are souls, it's an integral whole. And I think that our ability to comprehend and to understand this makeup, this composition, this integral composition of the cosmos as representing, the person, of the being of God. I suppose it will make a difference in how we relate, with the cosmos itself and all that is within. In other words, there's ethical implication, that is inherent, in Athanasius's conception, of creation, of Jesus embodying holding it together, being inside and outside at the same time. You know, I found that very profound. Thank you.
Thank you. And maybe if I can just probe that a little bit. Is this passage not also speaking to the logoi of each person? Is it not also suggesting to us not that we are God in the sense of the creator of all that is, but that we also, when we say yes to the word present in us and before us and in the life of the world, when we say yes to that, we are also not inside ourselves, confined, or just outside ourselves. That disposition is one that no longer sees oneself at the center, but is open to the unfolding of whatever is coming to greet us, open to the unfolding of the word that seeks to be spoken, whether knowingly or not, in all our encounters with all of creation, with all of creation. It's so provocative to me that within the Christian East, I mean, it's there in the West too, so don't get me wrong, but within the East, there's a precision about it, of understanding that all we know of God, we know in the incarnation. We know in Jesus Christ. Anything else we assume about God is a kind of idolatry. And at the same time, for the patristics, Christology is our anthropology. Christology is our way of understanding the human person. So, is this passage also saying, I mean, it's speaking about Jesus Christ, but is it not also speaking about each of us as bearers of the Logos? That is, when we are not buried in ourselves, when we are attentive and present, drawing near communion to that which is other than us. That is, to use a phrase that's common, that is the presence of the kingdom. I sometimes think that those two biblical images that are very large, the presence of the kingdom and the fullness of the kingdom. And we have had some Orthodox thinkers that will point out that on either side of the royal gates, on the iconostas, and the iconostas, of course, is not a separation, it's a bridge. It's a way of seeing the drama of human life play out. On the, as you're facing it, on the left side of the iconostas is an icon of the incarnation, that is, of the Theotokos holding the Christ child. And on the right side, as you face it, is an icon of the Pantocrator, or God the Word, the God Word, the fullness of creation. And it's there between those two, between incarnation and the fullest expression of the Word, that human existence lives. So I know some, not many, but a few priests who, when they have baptized a person, an infant or an adult, I've seen it with infants, when they baptize the infant and when they've raised the child up, following in the name of the Father, in the name of the Son, in the name of the Holy Spirit, and they come forth from a womb, which was also a tomb. They come forth. They will say, Christ is among us. Christ is among us. Christos is here. And they will take the infant, process and dance around the holy table, and tenderly lay the infant right in the place of the royal gates. Incarnation, the fullness of the Word. This is where human life is. We live, to what extent we are alive, we are incarnate. But the presence of the kingdom is not sealable. It's not, we can't capture it. We can't make it into something. Presence of the kingdom is a living word. It's living relationships. And it is open always to the fullness that is unfolding and coming to greet us. So in the words of Maximus the Confessor, he calls this the ever-moving repose. This is speaking of, I don't know if the right word is tension. It certainly is a dynamic between incarnation and what is fully unfolding. This way of thinking of the presence of the kingdom, welcoming and opening to the fullness as it's unfolding, is a beautiful way, it seems to me, of saying, yes, we are, each human being is the image of God. And for that very reason, they are alive and in the process of becoming, not captured by whatever is, as if that can be sealed from what is unfolding and becoming, but to be present to what is unfolding and becoming, to be present to the newness of life, only occurs when you are present to the Logos, that is present to the Word that is both in you and between you and coming to fullness. In that, as Paul says, the Apostle Paul says, all life is made new, and is made new existentially. It's made new in every unfolding moment. Does that speak, Kahindi, to part of what you are calling us to think about?
Yeah, very much so. Thank you.
Other considerations?
I have a question for Simeon. Back in section 14, the when he's talking about restoring the icon, um, I thought of you, Simeon, immediately, and wondered in your own mind's eye how you imagined what Athanasius is describing just out of your own personal artistic experience. It may not be anything, but I thought I'd ask.
It's a lovely question.
Yeah. So certainly the metaphor, I guess, is what was striking, and I certainly paused there and thought about, what is that? It's funny, and I'll continue to think about it, I'm sure, for time to come. Oftentimes, it takes me a while to actually kind of untangle what's actually there. At present, and I don't know if I think this is taking it in a slightly different direction than St. Athanasius is writing, but what struck me the most was that in the text, he uses, in the metaphor, he's using a single individual, single artist doing this restoration. But the reality of this that I love within, especially the iconographic tradition, is that it's oftentimes over time many hands that actually get involved in such a process, and so and not just in restoring, but in further revealing and further beautifying an icon. And so I hesitate to say that because I know that's not at all what the text is. Even using this as an example of, but I enjoyed thinking about it and sort of remembering different experiences I've had where either something that I've started is continued and further revealed or made more beautiful by another, or occasions where I've been involved in that process too. It's something that I really love about the tradition. And anyway, again, that's it's not necessarily on track, but it's sort of where I ended up staying for a while and just enjoying the reality and the memory of. So I don't know if it helps at all, but that's all I can say honestly about it.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Simeon, can I ask a follow-up question? That was lovely. Then in just taking your example, leaving aside the metaphor from that, but what you talked about for a moment.
Yeah.
In your work then, like this, I'm not sure what you call it, restoration or whatever you call it, is beauty and revelation the same thing? Are you looking to reveal the beauty, or is it another word you think of? And that's not phrased well, but how do you as an artist, as a maker in the world, see those two words hanging together just in your own work?
Oh, yeah. I mean, everything we've talked about for the last 2 days is about is about, oh, how do I answer that? That's a very good question. Thank you. It's I'm probably using those interchangeably at the moment. But that's also kind of out of the personal joy of, as an artist, visual beauty is, I guess, my medium that I struggle to work in. But that beauty can only exist, I think, in any art, but especially with an iconography, when it's revealed in Christ. And David asked yesterday about the whole sort of just working with rocks and plants and such and other things. I'll just mention now that because there's play involved as well. I mean, it's really amazing what you can make color out of. My daughter just had 7 baby teeth extracted, so we're going to make tooth fairy black this weekend. Anyway, so there's play there too. But all those things, play and beauty and this, it's just the most marvelous thing when in working in that, whether in an original work, by which I mean a work that's beginning now, or one that's being restored, or one that's being further completed. As in the case when years and years ago, I had a deadline for an icon of St. Nicholas, and traditionally and very beautifully, you have the image of the Theotokos and of Christ on either side, and there simply wasn't time to do it with the deadline for it was a mission to Seafarers Chapel that was being set up, and so I had to leave it and say, well, somebody will paint those. I trust somebody will paint that someday. All that to say, the beauty that leads to a further revelation is really the most wonderful thing that I'm blessed to participate in occasionally. And of course, that's within a visual, but I expect that's true of all of us in our different fields.
So I ask you, Andrew.
Beautifully said. Beautifully said. Thank you. And there's lots there more that we could say. But one thing that strikes me is everything you just talked about, your own making, more or less echoes what we read in Athanasius about the making of creation in which we partake, made in communion, delight, joy, abundance. And not to make a point of this, because it does can sound a little bit fishy. But I think often we remind ourselves that we are made in the image of Christ. When we look at someone we would otherwise despise or look down upon, we go, no, no, no. He also is in the image of Christ. I can't. That happened to me recently, very recently. It was hard. I wanted to turn away, even knowing it was Christ, because it was too hard. But we forget too that goodness reveals Christ. And it seems to me that your art, you're partaking in the holiness of creation. That was really beautifully put. I don't want to make a whole thing, but thank you for that. And that's immense.
Thank you.
Beauty and revelation. One thing for certain, they can't be separated.
Mm-hmm.
When you're in the presence, when your gaze is drawn to, I think, any great work of art, you are actually drawn into a presence. That, to my mind, is what makes the difference between, as E. Cummings would put it, the difference between first-rate and second-rate art. And the difference between second and 10th rate is minuscule compared to the difference between first and second rate, because first-rate art addresses you. It draws you in and it addresses each of us. Well, thank you so much. Appreciate so much what you've brought to this and what you've had to say. So tomorrow is Wednesday, and we will be drawn into Athanasius's reflections on the death of Christ and the resurrection of the body. And our close readings will be section 21 and 29. Thank you so much. Have a blessed day.